Posten, co-chairman of the American Statistical Association's Committee for the Filming of Distinguished Statisticians. Today we have as our guest the very distinguished statistician, Dr. C R Rao, who has kindly consented to allow us to videotape him responding to questions from a panel of statisticians. This videotaping is sponsored by Pfizer Central Research, Pfizer Incorporated, and will be donated to the American Statistical Association for inclusion in its film archives. I am very pleased to welcome to this discussion our panel members. On my left, Dr. Frank Ancombe of Yale University. To his left, Dr. Gnanadesikan of the Bell Laboratories. To my far right, Dr. Koehn of the University of Connecticut. And next to him, Dr. Herman Chernoff of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I am also very pleased to welcome our guest, Dr. C R Rao, University Professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and Jawaharlal Nehru Professor at the Indian Statistical Institute. To start our discussion, I will begin with the first question. Dr. Rao, some years ago at a multivariate analysis meeting in Minneapolis, Oscar Kempthorne commented that he felt that much of multivariate analysis could be accomplished using simple univariate techniques. How much would you agree or disagree with this comment?
Perhaps Professor Kempthorne was thinking of tests of significance, whether there is difference in the mean values of in different characters between two populations and so on. In situations like this, it's okay to use univariate tests and perhaps supplement the univariate test by an overall multivariate test. But there are situations where you have to combine all the measurements together in order to take some decisions. For instance, the use of discriminant function needs a combination of several measurements, and that's purely a multivariate technique. Or in factor analysis, where we have to establish relationships between the various measurements, there you have to use essentially multivariate techniques. So there are situations where one has to do a multivariate analysis, and there are situations where one need not, and in fact one should not.
I would like to ask a question about normality of distributions in anthropometry. One would expect that most anthropometric variables would be affected by a large number of hereditary and environmental factors, and one might hope, because of the central limit theorem, that some of them would be nearly jointly normally distributed. Could you say something about how much has been done to actually investigate directly whether this is so?
It is true that measurements which exhibit continuous variation are perhaps determined by a large number of hereditary and environmental factors. But for normality, we want a particular measurement should be additive in the effects of these various factors. Characters like stature, for instance, the length of the arm, or the length of the head and breadth of the head and so on, do exhibit normality, and we have extensive studies on measurements from various series that some linear measurements do have normality. But take for instance a measurement like weight. Weight by itself does not exhibit normality, but maybe a transformation like logarithm or cube root might make the transform variable more normal. It then depends upon the nature of the measurement, whether it is a result of additive effects of factors or not. And it's quite possible that many measurements after transformation would satisfy the additive property, in which case they would have a normal distribution. But there is extensive evidence that most of the linear measurements have normal distribution.
One of the exciting aspects of being a statistician is the interaction that one has with people in other disciplines. and the two-way impact of such interactions, namely the benefit to the other discipline and the feedback into statistics. As one who has had vast experience in such interactions, I wonder if you'd care to reminisce about your experiences in this role as a statistician interacting with people in other disciplines.
My general experience as a consultant is that somebody comes with lots and lots of data, he throws on my table and then say, do statistical analysis. He is not clear as to what type of problems we can ask from the data, or whether the data are comprehensive enough to answer the questions he has in mind. Well, my first task would be to engage him in conversation to find out what his problems are and how he arrived at these measurements. It is extremely important for a statistician to know the mechanism which generated the observations that an experimenter brings to us. It is the mechanism which would enable us to find out an appropriate model for the observations. And it's very difficult to elicit all the answers from the scientists. So you should be satisfied with whatever information they give, but there is something which statisticians learn by experience, namely how to talk with the data itself. So you ask the data, are you comprehensive enough to answer questions like this? There is also another important question. We must also make sure that the experimenter or the scientist has not faked the data. Now, if you ask him, he will say it's all genuine. So we should have in our statistical methodology appropriate ways of examining the data, whether they are genuine or not. Well, there will be some stage at which you have to have dialogue with the scientists for the interpretation of the results. But in between, you have to depend solely on the data before you to talk to it and do the appropriate analysis.
If I may interrupt, I find sometimes that consultees are of two types. Some who are a little confused about the statistical issues, but not too infrequently they're a little more confused about their own scientific issues and therefore think it's a statistical problem, whereas a fundamental problem is not statistical. Do you find that often in your experience?
Yeah, this is what I was trying to emphasize. Very often they come and say, do the statistical analysis. Of course, we have to make sure what kind of problem he's trying to solve, or what kind of data he has, and so on.
If I could get back to Dr. Ancombe's idea, the normal distribution has clearly played an overwhelming role in statistics. On the other hand, the study of robustness and nonparametrics can be viewed as playing down that role. Do you view the normal distribution, except for asymptotic ideas, as essentially a technical assumption that we have to make now and that will disappear as we know more and more about statistics, or do you think it's basic to the field?
There are various multivariate techniques which are not based entirely on normality assumption. For instance, the linear discriminant function has an interpretation that it is the maximum distance between two populations in terms of a linear combination of measurements, and it is standardized with respect to the standard deviation. It is true that if the two populations have normal distributions, the linear discriminant function is the optimum method of discriminating between the two. However, it has its own justification apart from the normality of distributions. Now, of course, one has to have some basic distribution in order to carry out tests of significance. But the modern tendency is not to indulge in tests of significance too often. For this purpose, probably it is better to work with a wider class of distributions, which will include the multivariate normal distribution as one member, and then review the data with respect to this wider class. For instance, Fraser would probably take in the univariate case a class of distributions which may be symmetric, but which has normal distribution as one member. So with respect to this class, he would study whether the given hypothesis is true or not. So there is some need in the multivariate case to undertake studies of such type. That is, not to consider our sample or our observations as a sample from a particular distribution like the multivariate normal distribution, but consider a wider class of distributions which will include the multivariate normal distribution, remember. So we will regard our observations as coming from a member of a wider class of distributions. Then there is less chance of committing an error of specification of the distribution which is relevant to our particular observations. It is true that in the univariate case we have a large number of non-parametric tests, but most of these tests are meant for testing of hypotheses. Even in the multivariate case, most of the non-parametric tests are devised to test null hypothesis. But that's a very restricted view of solving problems, just to test the hypothesis. So if you want to, for instance, construct a discriminant function, well, there are no non-parametric methods, and I doubt whether there are efficient non-parametric methods for the problem of discrimination. So I would suggest always working with a flexible type of distribution, a flexible class of distributions, and regard our observations as coming from a member of that class, so that our inferences will not be very wrong.
Well, there's been some current work on methods of pattern recognition and recursive partitioning schemes, which are supposedly non-parametric methods for doing discrimination and classification. And perhaps some of the recent work that's coming out is a partial answer to your criticism of that.
Well, we must make a distinction. By non-parametric, I mean converting the observations into some sort of ranks and working with them. Now, the method you are referring is not to use any particular distribution in arriving at the discriminant function. So, for instance, if you have a set of points in a two-dimensional graph, surely you can try to draw a line, for instance, separating one set of points from another. That is a non-parametric approach to get a discriminant function for quantitative variables. So there is difference, but in other situations, for instance, non-parametric tests of hypothesis would ignore the observations completely and work in terms of ranks. So this is the distinction I want to make. Well, I agree that we should try to arrive at discriminant functions without completely depending on the fact that they are coming from particular distributions. There is in fact very good work being done in this direction.
That last question seems to have some bearing on the question I wanted to ask, and that was the effect of modern computers. In the early years of multivariate analysis, of which you spoke a bit earlier today, you referred to the difficulty of computing with very large matrices of covariances, and now that's no longer a problem. In fact, one can invert huge matrices now. It's possible to go to much higher dimensions than one could have envisioned possible 20 years ago. And the question that comes up is, are there going to be new theoretical approaches that will have to be developed to handle this high dimensionality that is now feasible with the modern computer.
I'm glad you referred to this problem, because this is engaging now the attention of many statisticians. We face a particularly difficult problem in multivariate analysis. We can theoretically take a very large number of measurements on a specimen or an individual, but the difficulty is to get these observations on a sizable number of individuals. So we have two problems. One is n, the sample size, p, the number of measurements. Now, all the statistical multivariate techniques we have now require that n should be larger than p. Otherwise, the variance covariance matrix blows up and you can't do any computations. But so to avoid such situations, they always either throw away some measurements or with their own investigation not try to make a large number of measurements. This, I think, is very unfortunate. So you have a finite number of individuals and you have theoretically an infinite number of measurements on each specimen. Especially we have mechanical devices now by which you can take any number of measurements if you take a picture of an individual. We need not go and use instruments to take his height and length of the arm and so on. We just take a three-dimensional picture of an individual, bring it to the laboratory, then the number of measurements you can take is enormous. So how to utilize this information in analysis? So even in tests of hypotheses or in construction of discriminant functions, we don't know what to do. So this is a very urgent problem in multivariate analysis. Of course, we need the computer because at least we need it for even if you have some technique by which you can reduce the number of measurements, not by throwing away the measurements as such, but probably combining different groups of measurements and trying to get a reduced composite number of characters. Then they may be amenable to the usual methods of multivariate analysis, for which we need the computers anyway, because any multivariate problem requires the computation of the eigenvalues of matrix, or taking the inverse of a matrix, or computing a large quadratic form. So we have to use the computers, and it is good that they have taken away the burden of computation from the statisticians. But then now we face this new problem of over-dimensional data and how to cope with it. I have seen many papers where they suggest, okay, we look at the correlation table. If two variables are highly correlated, we throw one away. Now, I have demonstrated on several occasions that's not the right way of doing things. I myself engaged in research of that type. I hope many people will look at the problem and try to produce good solutions.
Dr. Rao, sometimes when using multivariate tests, there's a loss of power as compared to using a univariate test on a single response. This phenomenon has been called Raos Paradox. Since your name is associated with it, would you please give us some idea of what the problem is, and perhaps, if possible, some idea of how frequent its occurrence is?
This paradox I tried to point out several years ago. I came across several years ago when I was trying to test whether the length of a bone has the same mean value in two different populations. So I had two measurements on two bones. I did separate tests on each bone. I found the difference was significant. Then I put the measurements on the two bones together into a bivariate test using Hoteling's t-square. I did not get significance. So this is the paradox I pointed out. Of course, as I said earlier, when it comes to establishing differences between two groups, you are well off by looking at each measurement separately. But I would also suggest that individual tests can be supplemented by an overall test. Now each has its own story to tell. There are situations where no individual test would be significant, but you put them together, then the overall test becomes significant. And the other situation where the overall test is not significant, but if you carry out tests on individual measurements, each one would be significant. So in the first situation, what it would tell us is that there is not much difference in the individual measurements, but still they are all pointing out in one direction, and there is overall significance in the mean values of the two populations. Now in the other case, it's our inability to combine individual tests that is leading to this paradox. Now in the problem of joint test on the two bones I mentioned, if I had a larger sample size, the test based on two measurements would be more efficient than the test based on individual measurements. But again, we run into this problem where we do not have a big sample, but we have a large number of measurements. So the combined test is always going to be inefficient in a situation like that. So I would suggest that we do test on individual measurements, but at the same time supplement that by an overall test, since each has some information to give on the differences between the two populations you are considering.
How do you handle it, though, when you find that in one direction, using one of these approaches, you do get significance and then you get disagreement with the other? What do you do then?
No, I suppose we should go by differences that we find from the individual tests. Because there will be marginal cases like just one, there is difference in one of the characters, but not in all the others, and the overall test does not show difference. So in a case like that, we can say that the one case where we found significance is a spurious one. But suppose I find out of 10 individual tests, 6 of them showed significance and the overall test did not show significance, I would still say that there are differences in the individual measurements. So one has to...
I think Harry's raised sort of a theoretical issue, namely, if we're carrying out a test of hypothesis in a theoretical way, well, we either have to decide in favor or against, and then how does one resolve this difficulty? Do we decide for or against? But the alternative way of looking at this is that this isn't a theoretical test of a significance, it's namely one step in an ongoing investigation, and if we do get this borderline situation, it just is a way of directing us a little further into the investigation rather than a final conclusion.
Of course, if one is making, say, 100 tests in 100 independent situations, so even if the null hypothesis is the same in all situations, probably in 5 cases you would say there is difference. So there is the danger. What the overall test does is one method of combining the individual tests. So we have, for instance, the Fisher's test, where there's a method of combining a number of tests which may arise in rather quite different situations. For instance, you take the logarithm of the p-values and adds them to get a chi-square test. Now, this is primarily to see when the individual tests are not individually significant, whether by combining them we can establish significance or not. Because all p-values may not be as low as 5% or 1%. Suppose they are all around about 10% and 8%. If you combine them, you will get significance. So one has to keep in mind that when we do carry out certain tests repeatedly, sometimes significance may we may be able to observe significance even though there is no difference, even though there is no deviation from the null hypothesis.
I would like to return a little to my previous question concerning the possibility of demonstrating normal distributions with anthropometric measurements. I would think that the field of anthropometry would be the most promising one to demonstrate joint normality in some distributions. When we assert that several variables are jointly normally distributed, we're saying something much stronger than that each variable is individually normally distributed. You mentioned that some anthropometric variables do indeed seem to be individually normally distributed, some kinds of length measurements. I would like to ask whether, to your knowledge, any rather serious attempts have been made to directly verify joint normality, and if so, how that would be done. As far as I'm aware, there are a number of procedures that one might follow. For instance, Mardia has proposed normality tests. His kurtosis test I have used somewhat and have been rather impressed by its sensitiveness to some departures from normality, but I'm sure it's not sensitive to everything. There are other things one can do besides those tests. One could make test procedures to detect a bivariate joint distribution, for instance. Could you, I know you've been very deeply interested in anthropometric work, can you sort of hold up some test examples in which rather convincing evidence was advanced that two or more variables were jointly normally distributed?
Well, I have done this in my early studies on anthropometric data. I had in my first project 12 measurements, and having satisfied myself that the marginal distributions are normal, I tried to test for linearity of regression of one against the other. It involved a good deal of work, and surprisingly I found that the regressions were linear. Of course, I wouldn't dare to go and see whether the trivariate normality holds or not. We know that if a marginal distribution is normal and the regression is linear and there is homoscedasticity, then we have a bivariate normal distribution. But I suppose one could, well, it gives some sort of convincing evidence that when the marginals are normal and the regressions are linear, then possibly we have a multivariate normal distribution. Yes. At least the further statistical analysis done on the basis of multivariate normal distribution will not lead us astray, I suppose.
In discussing Herman Chernoff's earlier question about computers and their effect on multivariate analysis, I noticed that you focused on the numerical computational possibilities and feasibilities with computers. In your earlier talk, of course, you also touched on another and far more exciting aspect of modern computing, I think, which is the graphical technology that is becoming available. I wonder if you'd care to comment and expand more on the advantages and disadvantages of graphical technology as it affects multivariate analysis and the practice of multivariate analysis.
I would think graphical techniques are extremely useful in statistical analysis. I do not know how many are aware that Fisher's Statistical Methods for Research Workers has an opening chapter on graphs, on diagrams. I always wondered why in an advanced book like that Fisher would talk about graphs and diagrams. Reading through, I found that it's extremely useful in many ways For instance, it tells us by just looking at the say the graph of two variables, for instance, that certain transformations would rectify some of the defects of the data, or certain transformations would enable us to use a bivariate normal distribution. And he also shows that if there are violent departures due to one or two observations, it can be detected by looking at the graph. And I believe in research work, one actually looks at the graph and tries to guess the relationship between variables. And we indulge in statistical analysis only to make sure that what we have observed from the graph is not misleading. So I believe that we should be using more of graphical methods. I was particularly interested in Chernoff's phases, which is a fascinating study in the use of graphical techniques. I think that
the main point.
I hope that in future research workers will give a lot of attention to, well, plotting, for instance, multidimensional data and trying to see what it has to convey to us. Graphical methods also enable us to look for problems which we have not posed earlier before looking at the data.
It raises sort of an interesting question. I've noticed there are a few people using kinematic approaches to graphing, and I find that when I look at it, it passes me by, and it reminds me of seeing computer hackers working at a CRT tube. They don't use a pencil and paper. They seem to be able to communicate with the machine. And I think I'm in the older generation. I need a pencil and paper. I have to look at a graph in front of me. I can't use the computer in a kinematic way. And I just wonder now whether there will be a new generation who will be capable of interacting with data in a much more natural fashion than we old-timers are.
Well, of course, I think the interactive mode now exists even with numerical computations. You sit in front of a scope and not necessarily get hard copy even of numerical computation, so I don't think that's necessarily.
But I can sort of concentrate on it because even on the CRT tube, it's there and fixed, and I can't take out a pencil and paper and copy it down. But seeing dancing figures in front of me, that's hard to grasp.
No, one advantage with these techniques is you can look at a three-dimensional plot, which is not possible on paper.
Right.
And that helps redeem.
And if time is a dimension, particularly the kinematic kind of thing has a natural role to play.
Many statistical techniques, of course, have been motivated by, most of them, by the various fields of application. Going back to Gauss and the least squares application to astronomy, and so much of the design of experiments coming from Fisher's work, agriculture. Do you see any particular fields now that are going to spur real statistical progress in the future?
Of course, we should also mention that the psychology would generate a lot of research and factor analysis.
Yeah, I listed a few examples.
Education.
I don't want to suggest it's exhaustive.
I believe that there is a very wide area in medical diagnosis which need special techniques. Attempts have been made to use discriminant analysis, for instance, to diagnose between two types of diseases. But I don't think they have been very successful. For instance, disease categories are not discrete categories. There is a whole spectrum from good health to illness, and we should be able to locate by taking multiple measurements or making number of diagnostic tests where in the spectrum a particular individual falls and what type of treatment he needs. Now, this is a problem which has not been considered very seriously by statisticians. They are still thinking that there are two categories, like a person will have heart attack or will not have heart attack, or he needs surgery or he does not need surgery. But that doesn't constitute medical diagnosis as such. These are all decisions taken by the doctors, not on the basis of statistical evidence, but various other considering various other factors. So I would think the field of medical diagnosis, or to phrase it in a proper way, the use of multiple diagnostic measurements to decide on the proper stage of health of an individual, health or illness of an individual. I think we need special statistical techniques for that. Maybe the next breakthrough would be in this area.
Well, when I went into statistics, I feel that myself and a lot of the colleagues who went in at that time went in for very peculiar reasons. We sort of fell into the field. But shortly after that, it became very popular. There was a flush of enthusiasm after World War II, and all of a sudden people came out of the woodwork, and all sorts of very good people were interested in statistics. But nowadays I have a feeling that there's more action in other fields, and good students are hard to get into statistics, that they never will get educated enough to know that there's something really exciting about statistics. Do you have any words of advice about how to rectify this situation?
Well, I don't blame students if they don't study statistics. Naturally, one chooses a course of study which is very prospective, which will give him a good job after he finishes his degree.
Statistics satisfies that requirement.
Well, if statisticians are paid as much as engineers or computer scientists, then surely students will come and study statistics. There's also another problem. Perhaps we have not done enough propaganda for statistics. We have not gone and talked to managers of factories and corporations and tell them that statistics is very useful. It will be a good investment to hire a statistician.
Well, Harry seems to have been successful with Pfizer Corporation. Maybe we can put him to work on a few other places.
We have other companies and other universities contributing in the same manner to videotaping various distinguished statisticians too.
The main problem is I do not think that a manager of a company thinks that a statistician is more useful than a computer scientist or an economist. Even if he makes bad predictions, so he is hired because he is able to give some information on which they can formulate their policies or base the production of commodities. But they do make mistakes like the production of automobiles and so on. So I don't think, if it comes to hiring a statistician or an econometrician, possibly they would prefer an econometrician and not a statistician, because he will be able to help them in a much better way.
I have an interesting example here. Once a long time ago, I was asked by a company to look at the forecasting mechanism of the company, and I went down to their corporate headquarters and talked to some people about forecasting, and I asked them how they forecasted the demand on a certain production plant. And he told me they got around in a circle and they simply asked everybody, and then they came to an agreement. And I asked the question, how do you judge the quality of the agreement? Do you keep records? And he indicated they did not.
Well, I would also suggest that maybe we should change our curriculum of courses in statistics. I know in India, when before we think of formulating courses in statistics, we look to the demand. If there is demand for a large number of statisticians to work in industry, so we lay great emphasis on statistical methodology for, say, for quality control or operations research, so that we'll be able to sell them. That these are experts who can handle problems in design of experiments, for instance, or solve a problem in operations research. Then there is a greater chance of they're being hired by, say, in industry, for instance.
But I haven't noticed any difficulty of people with graduate degrees in statistics getting jobs. A statistician with a master's degree can find a job very easily. He may not get quite as much as a computer scientist or an electrical engineer.
Why not? Why not?
Well, but aside from the fact that he may not do quite as well as those, he does rather well compared to almost anybody else, with the possible exception also of the econometrician, who might have an upper hand.
See, they are looking for immediate benefits when they hire an expert. So
that may be, but think of the prospective student who says, is there a job for me if I go into statistics? And I say, of course there is, and a well-paying job. So that, I don't think, is the main difference.
well, I'm only saying statistics may be a third choice. And people who cannot get admission into engineering school or business school, and they go in for statistics. Maybe we should change our courses and try to produce a new type of individuals and try to sell them who are more useful in government and in industry. Even in Washington, I find there are more econometricians than statisticians in the government.
That's right, because there aren't enough statisticians to meet the demand.
And at least according to the National Science Foundation projections for 1990, that's going to be still true, except for computer scientists, that statisticians are going to be the most deficient in number. So I think from the job market point of view, it's probably true that statisticians have a rosy future.
I think that one of the real problems is a lot of people don't understand what statisticians do. You can understand what an econometrician does. What does a statistician do?
That's why I said we must do some propaganda. It's not that there won't be jobs in statistics in the future, but when it comes to taking a decision, say in your own son's case, if he comes and asks you, Daddy, should I go for statistics or for computer science? You would say as a father, take computer science. So this is the difference.
I usually tell them to take both. Dr. Rao, could you tell us some of the highlights of your career which have given you the most satisfaction? Not necessarily restricted to multivariate analysis.
Well, I know it's a difficult question, but I can think of two things. One is I'm very proud of my students. I have possibly 100 students of mine working in the United States, and they are doing extremely well. Some of them are in the universities, and they have done very good research. So I have some sort of satisfaction that possibly I've been able to inspire them to do some good work in statistics. The second thing is, when we do research work, we always look for some recognition. Some people should say, yes, you are doing good work. Or other people refer to your work in their own publications. I suppose there are a few instances where work done by me has been referred to by others, and the methods which I have devised have been found useful in practical applications. This, I suppose, is what gives the maximum satisfaction to a scientist or to a teacher.
Okay.
I wonder if I could ask you a very broad question about statistical theory. Today, we're all very much aware of robustness considerations. We admit that distributions probably are not precisely any parametric type that one would readily name. Modern statistical theory is based in, has been immensely influenced by Fisher's theory of estimation, and Fisher's ideas on estimation, likelihood function, sufficiency, exhaustive estimation, and emphasis on exact distributions. All those things obviously immensely interesting, which have greatly inspired the statistical world. Those things are, as it were, based on assumptions that you know what a family of parent distributions is, and now we have this sneaking doubt at the back of our mind that we really don't know those things so well. What do you see now as the place in the whole scheme of statistical theory for Fisher's theory, which would appear on the face of it to be rather unrobust? What is its importance now in the robustness era?
I think I would like to add to your list Bayesian inference, where assumptions are made not only on the basic distribution of observations given the parameter, but also on prior distribution.
Yes.
So they are doubly wrong if we think Fisher was wrong in making assumptions on the basic distributions. But we must agree that Fisher mainly worked in genetics, where, for instance, the binomial distribution plays a very important role, and so also the Poisson distribution. There we know that certain events of a binomial distribution. In situations like this, I think Fisherian ideas are very useful, using the likelihood or maximum likelihood estimation and so on. But in other cases, as I said some time back, that of course one should not entirely depend upon a certain basic distribution being true when we do data analysis. We must always choose a wider class of distributions and refer our observations to possibly a member of that class. There is a good deal of interesting work that's being done now by Fraser and Bordorf-Nielsen and Barnard and others. So this is one way of getting around. But we should not go entirely non-parametric, because non-parametric methods are somewhat inefficient. It may be that non-parametric methods are useful if you want what Tukey calls quick and dirty methods. But or it may be that we use non-parametric methods for a preliminary test, but we should always try and see whether we could still view our observations as coming from a wider class of distributions, but still use parametric methods.
If I might make one further remark, I was particularly thinking of the sort of work which is presented in Huber's recent book on robust statistics, and one minimal justification for the study of Fisherian estimation theory would be that without that you would find that book completely unintelligible. However, I would suspect that there is indeed more reason for studying Fisherian estimation theory than that it's a prerequisite for robustness.
Well, we cannot avoid the concept of likelihood or maximum likelihood. I was only saying that you put in more parameters in your distribution so that will widen our inference, the basis of our inference. Of course, it's also, we find that the statistical inference based on the normal distribution all somewhat robust. The procedures are.
Yeah, I would like to quibble a little bit with your apparent approach. Anyway, I would say that in many cases, Fisher's methods are remarkably robust. And another point, though, is that even when they're not necessarily robust, you apply a technique like maximum likelihood, and in many situations where you had no idea what's a good method before, after you throw that into the meat grinder, you come out with a procedure which you then can look at and see if it really is appropriate. It can suggest methods which you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. And if they're no good, then you have to discard them. But very often they're surprisingly good, although sometimes we can find examples where they're surprisingly bad.
So we use the normal distribution only to arrive at estimates and test criteria, but we won't accept them unless we are sure that they are at least somewhat robust.
I'd like to return to the topic that you mentioned in passing of perhaps we should be changing things in the curriculum of statistics, and ask you sort of a hypothetical question of, if you were asked to name the three most important things that a program of education and training for statisticians should encompass, what would your choices of these three things be?
Well, apart from some standard statistical methodology, I believe everyone should have some idea of design of experiments, because that's one way of collecting data to answer particular questions. Or the second thing I would suggest is sample surveys, because all the time we are collecting data, collecting information, so we must know what are efficient methods of collecting information. And every statistician must take courses in design of experiments and sample surveys. And possibly a third area of application is prediction. That is going to be extremely useful. And I would suggest, besides the standard statistical methodology, if statisticians are exposed to three areas, they would be able to meet the questions that will arise when they go to work in some place.
If you had a young, say, undergraduate coming to you and you sort of suggested what things he should do in statistics, what kind of other background would you look for him? If he had one statistics course, he wanted to sort of go into the field, what other kind of background would you suggest to him? What kinds of things should he do in statistics and out of statistics?
Well, I think that every statistician should specialize in some area. It doesn't matter what that area is. It could be economics, it could be biology, or it could be genetics. Because when somebody studies physics, he tries to solve a problem in physics. When somebody studies chemistry, he tries to solve a problem in chemistry. Now, we are not studying statistics to solve a problem in statistics. So we are studying statistics in order to solve problems in other areas. So there is some sort of conflict here. We are all the time giving courses and teaching the statistical methodology. So after learning all this, what is he going to do? There is nothing like a purely statistical problem which you can solve with the help of statistics. So it's extremely important that one who reads statistics gets interested in some area of application. It always pays. Of course, you could end up as a teacher and teach what our teachers have taught us, but this is not good for the training of a statistician.
Excuse me, we have about time for one more short question. Would you ask one?
Well, one short question is, what do you regard as the interesting novel ideas that have come out in statistics in the last few years? It's a short question, takes a long answer.
I suppose the emphasis on robust estimation, which is worth pursuing. There are also attempts at in the multivariate area of combining quantitative and qualitative data in order, for instance, to produce a discriminant function. A third area is to construct, for instance, a discriminant function without making any assumptions on the basic probability distributions. There are quite a number of papers that I have seen recently in these areas, and these, I suppose, are some of the interesting areas where research is going on in statistics.
It is now time to finish this discussion, and in conclusion, I would like to thank the panel participants, Dr. Uwe Koehn, Dr. Herman Chernoff, Dr. Frank Ancombe, and Dr. Ram Gnanadesikan, and in particular, our guest, Dr. C R Rao. Very good again.
Thank you.